Welcome back to the channel, everybody. This is Nick with Idaho Up, and today we're completing video 4 of our 4-part video series. And if you missed the first 3 videos, I'll put a link right here so that you can go check those out. Today we're going to wrap everything up. We're going to install the stereo mic. I'm going to show you the best place to install the aftermarket GPS antenna so that it's out of sight and out of mind. And we're going to install an aftermarket USB-C port. And after that, we're going to install the door chime that we talked about in video number 2. If these videos have been helping you out, make sure you subscribe to the channel and give a like to each video so that I can continue bringing you good automotive related content. So let's dive in and get this wrapped up. The first thing we're going to do is install the microphone, and this is super easy, so I'm just going to give you a quick rundown on this one. The microphone plugs into the back of the head unit. You can really put it wherever you want. I chose to run mine from the back of the head unit, underneath the dash, and up to the A-pillar on the driver's side where the original stock microphone is also located. You'll notice that you'll have to pull the A-pillar trim slightly forward, exposing the white clip, and you'll run your wire inside this piece of trim. Then you'll just use the hook located on the Bluetooth mic to hook it around the A-pillar trim near the driver's side sun visor. This is the same location where your factory microphone is going to be located if you have that option on your C6, and I chose just to leave that alone. Using this route and some small zip ties, you'll be able to tuck the wire away nicely. Just remember not to zip tie the wire to any moving components. Start this process out by passing the microphone wire underneath the dash through a hole that leads to the back of the head unit. From here, it should be pretty smooth sailing, but as with anything else, practice some patience and it'll be a lot more enjoyable. And that's it for the mic. Now we're going to replace the factory GPS antenna with the aftermarket GPS antenna.
This is the stock GPS antenna that was plugged into the stock unit before we took it out to the stock head unit. And this is the aftermarket one that's going to go with the new head unit I'm putting in. And I've been trying to decide where I was going to put this. And I think I'm just going to stick it to this plate. I'm going to unscrew this one and take it off. Stick it to this plate. And this plate is actually tucked up back under there, and it sits right on that plastic post right there, and then there's another poster on the corner. And you'll notice that there's 2 holes in this, and it's retained by these 2 little plastic clips. So I'm going to take this one off, and I'm going to put that right back onto it and put those clips, and then just stick it back under the dash and reuse it, and I think I'll be fine. I think if this one was catching a signal from 2013, and this one should be just fine. And hopefully that works out, but that's what I'm going to do because I really didn't like the idea of just sticking it on my dash somewhere with the cord sticking out. So I'm just going to go that route, and we'll see if it works out.
Well, I'm glad to report that this plan worked out perfectly, and I'm glad it did because I really didn't want to stick the GPS antenna on the top of my dash, and this is just a super clean way to tuck it away. After removing the factory GPS, just clean it up real good before you put the new GPS adhesive pad on there, and then trim it up, clean it up again, and then go ahead and stick the new GPS on it, and you're good to go. Here's a shot of the automotive clips that are used to mount the plate. However, I did have an issue with one of them, so let's get into that.
Okay guys, so there's where it's sitting at. So the GPS is sitting right on top of that metal plate. I was able to get one of those plastic things back in, but I couldn't for the life of me get the other one on this other corner in. I don't even know if you can see it. Hang on. Right there. So if you can see up in the left-hand corner, top corner, you'll see a zip tie. And that's what I did instead, because on that one you could see the bottom of that plastic thing, unlike that one sitting on the tower. So I just took a zip tie and I pushed the the fat end with the screwdriver and pulled on the other end until it was tight. So now that plate's sitting right where the stock one was.
From here, you just reroute the GPS wire so it's not blocking anything like the climate vents, and then it'll ultimately just plug right into the back of the head unit. That's it for the GPS antenna. Now we're going to install the aftermarket USB-C. In video number 1, I mentioned that I wanted to install an aftermarket USB-C port, and because I'm not a smoker, I decided to go ahead and replace my ashtray with that port. I could have put it in the center console, but I hate putting my phone in the center console. I just feel like it's always a hassle to get to, so this is where I chose to put it. Keep in mind the Sony unit is a wireless Apple CarPlay unit, so the only time I'm really going to be using this port is when I need to charge my phone. Right here I'm just using the mounting block for the USB-C port so that I can determine where to put my holes so that I can mount it inside the ashtray. You're also going to have to drill a larger hole through the back of the ashtray so that you can pass the cable through it so that it can plug into the back of the head unit. Now I'll be honest, the one thing I didn't account for is that on the inside of the ashtray, when you open it and close it, there's another piece of plastic inside that you're also going to need to put a hole through. If I could do it again, I'd make sure that I put my hole in a place where there was still a piece of plastic on the top side of that inner piece. And the reason I tell you that is because when you open and close the ashtray, you can feel the gears, and after I put this hole through the top portion of it, I could tell that the gears weren't quite as tight. But I haven't had a problem with it, so I think I'm okay, but it's something to consider. I also think it's important to be honest with my viewers so they can avoid similar mistakes and maybe consider different options. Here I'm just going to use some small bolts and some lock washers and some small nuts to mount the USB block inside the ashtray. I'm going to warn you that you're going to have to use as small as hardware as you can because you need to remember this piece sits right underneath the vehicle climate controls and it's going to be a tight squeeze. I would even recommend using smaller nuts than the ones you see in this video. They worked, but the squeeze was definitely tighter than I preferred. Another tip is make sure you use a bolt with an Allen key head so that you can get an Allen key in it to tighten it down. This would be kind of hard to do with a screwdriver. When you have it all tightened down, you can go ahead and reinstall it back onto the center stack trim that we took out in video number 1. Now I did want to touch on the center console real quick, and that's because some C6s will have a USB and an aux input inside the center console, and because it's no longer hooked up to the stock radio, it's not going to work. So I'm going to remove mine because I don't like having things on my vehicles that don't work, and I'll be keeping an eye out for a blank that will match the vehicle. I typically find things like that eventually. And that's it for the USB-C install. Now we're going to go ahead and install the aftermarket door chime that came with the PAC unit that I mentioned in video number 2. Now one thing I'll warn you about here is that the cord that leads from the PAC unit to the aftermarket door chime is not that long. You need to keep this in mind when you're deciding where to mount your aftermarket door chime, but luckily on the C6, well at least on mine, this screw right here was in the perfect location to mount the chime. I did have to replace the screw with a smaller head so that it would fit into the chime notch, but other than that, it worked out great. And that's it for the door chime. It's as simple as that, although I did tell you I was going to show you how to fix the kick panel I broke in video number 3, so I'm going to do that real quick. First, I'm going to install both parts of the kick panel that I broke in half before I tie them back together. I also wanted to point out that most of the pieces I've taken off the car you just put back on in the reverse order, and that's pretty simple. But on this piece right here, I wanted to point out that you have to have this section right here lined up with the venting system on the car, or your hot and cold air won't blow correctly. So take your time when you're putting this one back on and make sure it's lined up. Here's another shot that gives you a better idea what the venting system looks like. Okay guys, I just want to point out when you put this piece back in on the passenger side,
you notice that there's a heating duct going through it, heating and cooling, and you want to make sure you line that up with that duct right there so that your air is coming through properly. So just wanted to point that out before we throw in the last two pieces of plastic and clean up the car a little and put the mats back in. And then there's a hole back here that this little piece of plastic goes into, and then you use your clip to secure it. And you can see the vent right up there, and it's actually just barely over it. So that's how it looks. We'll get that last clip in there. That's how she sits up there.
From here I'm going to drill a hole in the corner of both the pieces I broke that's large enough for a zip tie to pass through, and then after I mount them both to the car, I can pass a zip tie through those two holes, and the larger piece will hold up the smaller piece. And this actually worked out really well. I haven't had any issues with it. We're on the home stretch, but don't forget to take the antenna adapter for the AM and FM radio that came with the PAC unit and plug it in. The other end of the antenna will plug directly into the back of the aftermarket head unit. I like to take some electrical tape and tape together the side that plugged into the vehicle. Now you can plug the PAC unit into the factory wiring harness. As a side note, you're going to notice that the kick panel in this video isn't installed yet. Don't worry about stuff like that. I jumped around in the video to make it easier for you to follow. This goes for the stock GPS antenna and the door chime as well. We've already covered all those topics, but if you have a question, drop me a comment. Now back to some things we haven't covered, and now we're going to plug in the pigtail for our forward-facing camera that we mentioned in video number 2. We're then going to cover the metal connections with a piece of heat shrink tubing and then hit them with the heat gun. Again, we talked about this in video number 2, so if you need to jump back to that for a reference, go ahead and do so. Now we're just going to rinse and repeat that step with the backup camera. Now we're ready to put the car back together, and we've made every connection that we need to make that's not related to plugging directly into the radio, and we've even talked about some of those. But before we put the aftermarket radio in, we're going to talk about everything that needs to be connected to the back of it so we don't have to remove it again because we made a mistake. So here we go. The first thing we're going to do is plug in the wiring harness for the radio that we had wired into the PAC harness in video number 2. Next, we're going to plug in the harness for the RCA cables, and this is where you're going to plug in both your backup and your front view camera. Next, we're going to plug in our GPS antenna, followed by our Bluetooth mic. You're not going to use the 3.5mm jack that came with the head unit. Instead, you're going to use the 3.5mm jack that comes off the PAC unit. And now you're going to connect your USB-C input, and last but not least, don't forget to connect your AM/FM antenna. And that's it, everyone, but make sure you test everything before you put your car all the way back together. Make sure the radio is working and that you're catching both an AM and an FM signal. Make sure your microphone's working. Make sure your USB-C cable's working. Make sure your backup and forward-facing camera are working. And make sure all of your steering wheel controls are working. And if something's not working, make sure you check all your wiring. And I do mean all your wiring, all the way back to the beginning. But before you do all that, in order to test all this stuff, make sure you plug in your battery. If it's all good to go, just make sure you reattach all your factory plugs before you snap in your trim panels. It really sucks to get a project like this done and then remember that you forgot to plug in your heated seats or your hazard lights or your cigarette lighters or your traction control. I think you get the point. And last but not least, guys, if you found this little video series helpful, make sure you subscribe to my channel and give a like to each of the videos so that I can keep bringing you good automotive related content. This is Nick with Idaho Up, and until next time, keep up.